see we've got quite a decent number of people in the room now, and just I'd like to invite Adam to kick us off, if that's okay.
So cool. Thank you. Ena mana, ena reo, ena iwi, rā rangatira mā, no mai, hara mai, piki mai, tēnā koutou, tēnā tātou katoa, kia ora, hui hui mai, tātou katoa. Kia ora everyone, I'm Adam Moriarty. Thank you for joining us today. Sorry, I'm Adam Moriarty from Auckland Museum, and sort of one of the members of the AI4LAM New Zealand Australia sort of chapter. Thank you for taking some time out today to join us. I'm looking forward to today's session. We've got two fabulous speakers. But before we continue, Alexis, would you like to introduce yourself?
Yeah, hi. Well, good morning to Australians and good afternoon to New Zealanders and anyone else who might be joining us. I'm the Manager of Digital Innovation here at the University of Adelaide. And just in opening, I'd like to acknowledge the Kaurna people, who are the original custodians of the Adelaide Plains and the land on which I'm working, and I'm joining you today. I recognise that we've got colleagues from all across the country joining us today, and I'd like to extend that respect to other traditional owners and acknowledge their past, present and ongoing connection to the land and cultural beliefs. I'd just like to welcome you all on behalf of the Australian and New Zealand chapter of Artificial Intelligence for Libraries, Archives, Museums. In case you are not familiar with this network, it's a collaborative framework for libraries, archives and museums to organise, share and elevate their knowledge about the use of artificial intelligence. In the early months of this chapter, we're pleased to report that around 90 people across Australia and New Zealand have joined the relevant Slack channel, with more on the email list, and have demonstrated a really high degree of interest and engagement. So that's really exciting to see. We're very happy to report that we had about 80 registrations today. So if this is your first AI4LAM webinar, we'd really like to welcome you and thank you for joining us. I just want to, in terms of housekeeping, point out that today's session will be recorded and that will be posted online after the event. You'll be sent a link to that, so please feel free to revisit or share with your colleagues. And I'd like to invite you to feel free to use the chat function at the bottom of your screen, in which you can introduce yourself, talk about your interest in the topic of today's discussion, or ask questions of our panellists at any point during the session. Our colleagues Ingrid Mason and Mary Filsell are participating in that chat function as well, and they're going to keep things ticking along behind the scenes and make sure that they're monitoring your questions. So with that, I might just hand back to Adam to introduce our excellent speakers for today.
Awesome, thank you. Now I have the great pleasure of introducing Sydney and Rhys. So for starting with, Sydney Shep is a reader in book history and the printer at Wai-te-ata Press, Te Whare or Wai-te-ata Te Herenga Waka, the Victoria University of Wellington. She focuses on the interdisciplinary study of transnational and cross-cultural book history and print culture in the context of history of empire, history of technology and the history of reading. Her current research focuses on big cultural data and collaborative kaupapa Māori approaches and is grounded in theories, methods and practices of digital humanities, spatial history and cultural informatics. In 2014, she was awarded a Marsden Fund grant, her third, to study William Colenso and the Victorian Republic of Letters, with a focus on personal geographies and global networks. Sydney is also a practicing letterpress printer, exhibiting book artist and designer bookbinder who undertakes creative research commissions at Wai-te-ata Press. So thank you and welcome, Sydney. Great having you here today. And Rhys Owen, a research fellow at Wai-te-ata Press. His background is in software engineering, logic and computation, and cultural informatics, including working with New Zealand Biographical Networks and the National Register of Archives, National Register of Archives and Manuscripts, which led him to a technical lead position in Sydney's Marsden-funded team researching William Colenso, and now a new role as creative coder and digital artist, which is totally a job title I want, in case anyone's asking. He now contributes to ongoing research and development in Māori information and knowledge systems using semantic web technologies as a member of Sydney's Victoria University Science for Technological Innovation National Science Challenge team. Crikey, it's what a biography for both of you. So, and at Auckland Museum, we've been watching the work that you've been doing for some time, and it's really exciting to have you talk about the project and the Marsden Grant project that you've been running. So I will hand over to you now. Thank you and welcome.
Oh, kia ora, welcome, bonjour. Ko Sydney Shep taku inua, he kaiwhakehere Wai-te-ata Press, te wharita o Wai-te-ata. And welcome to you all. It's great to kick off this session to share a bit about some of the research that we've been involved with over the last few years and some of the provocations that we hope will generate discussion about these kinds of projects within the cultural sector. But I thought I'd start off with my favorite museum in the world. And anytime, you know, they let me out of this country, if that's ever going to happen again, this is where I would want to go. So this is the Pitt Rivers Museum in Oxford. And it's about 26,000 objects, and it's the original collection that was collected by Lieutenant General Augustus Henry Lane Fox Pitt Rivers. I didn't give him that name. And he bequeathed his original collection to Oxford. And he'd gathered it as he went on his military excursions around the world, fighting in the Crimean War. He served in Malta, in England, Canada, and Ireland, and he was really interested in firearms and weaponry. So that was the core of the collection. He used a global network of friends, dealers, and auction houses to help build that collection. And today it's grown to over 500,000 items, including photographic, film, manuscript, and sound collections, as well as cultural heritage objects from around the world. And as you can see in this image or two, cabinet upon cabinet of stuff. You can't fit anything else, let alone visitors in there. Their stuff is arranged thematically, and the museum enables the visitor to explore families of objects across time and space and engage in a kind of archaeology of knowledge. Pitt Rivers' idea was to highlight how different cultures across different times solved similar design problems. What was called the typological series or comparative system helped to illustrate his views on the evolution of design and technology, what he called the connection of form, which in turn made him an influential figure in the development of archaeology and evolutionary anthropology. So like many other collectors, Pitt Rivers transformed his initial cabinet of curiosity and his collecting mania from a storehouse of static objects to a dynamic visual tool for creating, organizing, recording, and preserving knowledge. But I always thought, how do visitors interact with these Wunderkammern? The surfeit of objects seen here disposed in the bespoke display cabinets, or part of the museum's virtual tour on the right-hand side, where you can do a 360 and go absolutely dizzily through some of these collections. How do viewers make meaning of something like Neil Partington's photographic Kunst cabinet, his artist cabinet? These were shot at Te Papa, and this series called The Vault exemplifies that kind of combination of allurement and engagement with the kind of perplexity and curiosity. How do we look at things like this, whether it's the wet objects in the lower left-hand corner or the collection of skulls in the upper left? Quite a daunting prospect, even if you haven't been there. And what about this one, the attic at Wellington Museum? The top story of the museum that is basically, again, a cabinet of curiosities or a Wunderkammern. So one of my inspirations was the Wunderkammern, but the other was trying to probe what the nature of research actually was. Whether you're a historian or not, the idea of serendipity is an integral part of our toolkit. Part of the most exciting reason that we're lured back into archives again and again and again. So stumbling across hitherto unknown sources, making unexpected connections, and telling new stories with old objects is an experience that has been characterized as the allure of the archive, and indeed exemplifies the experience of the Wunderkammern, or the Cabinet of Curiosities. In her highly evocative work, Le Goût de l'Archive, the allure, or more precisely, the taste of the archive, French pre-revolutionary historian Arlette Farge suggests that the reality of the archive lies not in the clues it contains, but in the sequences of different representations of reality. So as a historian, she characterizes us as a prowler, one could even say a flaneur, Someone who is searching for what is buried away in the archives, yes. Looking for the trail of a person or event, yes. But always remaining attentive to that which has fled, which has gone missing, which is noticeable by its absence. I think of that allure as ghost-like, traces and suggestions, hints, whispers, odors that populate the archival encounter, and that the result is storytelling. It's a form of a palimpsest, a layering or an assemblage of objects that evoke much more than simply physical material forms. So, Wunderkammern, serendipity, and palimpsests. These were the inspirations for a 2016-17 exhibition at the Alexander Turnbull Gallery in Wellington called Unexpected Connections, co-curated by my research assistant, Charlotte Thompson-Darling, and technical lead Rhys Owen. As part of our Marsden-funded project on William Colenso and the Victorian Republic of Letters, we took a fresh look at the multi-layered world of 19th century polymath William Colenso and his contemporaries. Now, like many Victorians, William Colenso was a man of many interests, often best known as a printer, but also a missionary, a linguist, an educationalist, an author, a politician, a letter writer, botanist, lexicographer, explorer. Such polymaths, both male and female, lived rich, interconnected, transnational lives that populate the pockets and corners of our 19th century reimaginings. Yet they remain challenging figures for biographers and historians alike. In 1938, Jean-Paul Sartre asked, "Is biography even possible?" And some 70 years later, Elizabeth Podnieks remarked that today the two greatest challenges notable in biography arise both from technologies that allow for radical new ways of producing, disseminating, and theorizing the genre, and from an expansion of the definition of what constitutes biographical expression. So we thought one way of exploring what biography in the digital age might look like was via the exhibition, which used the popular Victorian aesthetic and knowledge-building platform of the Wunderkammer. Objects were grouped loosely by themes and housed in some of Turnbull's original bookcases. Period furniture and a Persian carpet evoked the gentleman's club or the salon. Viewers could sit, view, compose their own stories in an atmosphere of intimacy and reflection. Some visitors suggest we pipe in tobacco smoke. Others recommended a half-empty tumbler of whiskey on the revolving bookstand. Our key aim was to study the intercrossings of people, places, and communication forms, technologies, and practices that shaped 19th century knowledge networks. We asked, how can we model 19th century polymathic networks and think of biography as a complex concatenation of multidimensional and multimodal meshworks, in Tim Ingold's sense of the term, or as Tim Hitchcock terms them, life courses or life grids. Now, social network analysis is a pretty standard computational approach, but we also wanted to understand the development, circulation, and impact of ideas and practices across a broad spectrum of scientific, intellectual, religious, political, cultural, and social domains. How could a collection of both physical and digital objects help us to begin to understand the topography, the temporal and spatial groundedness of these interconnected worlds? A highlight of the exhibition and its ongoing legacy artifact is the digital artwork entitled Unexpected Connections, Reimagining the 19th Century Through Generative Art. I hope you had a chance to explore, be amazed, be curious, and be filled with the kind of unexpected connectivity that we thought of when we were imagining, let alone building this. The work composes multi-layered images, those palimpsests drawn randomly from a curated collection of some 300 digitized objects. And it complements the visual or the physical exhibition by suggesting, if not exposing, how serendipitous links between objects can be assembled to create beautiful artworks, evocative palimpsests that have the potential to reveal new connections and tell new stories. Unexpected Connections took a fresh look at the Australian academic printmaker and creative coder Mitchell Whitelaw's interactive work, Succession, Digital Fossils for an Industrial Age. Michael was up at Newcastle on Tyne, and he was thinking of exploring, what does industrial capitalism mean today? What is its effect in the contemporary modern moment? What is the future for industrial capitalism? His work reveals layers of our shared heritage, rearranging and compressing them to seek out new meanings and latent stories. As he says, our industrial culture was founded on coal, a fossil fuel, a compressed residue made from the dead bodies of ancient plants and animals. For him, succession in turn produces visual fossils, compressed energy to fuel reflection on the past and speculation on the future. I'll turn now to my colleague Rhys to explain how we localize the project critically, technically, and aesthetically, and some of the challenges that emerged along the way. We'll then conclude with some observations of the future of this legacy project. So over to you, Rhys.
Thank you, Sydney. Thank you, everybody, for being here. I'm Sydney's software guy. I was her tech lead on this project, and she simply asked me to localize, to pick up Mitchell Whitelaw's work and produce a version suitable for the Colenso exhibition. So I'm going to dive straight in and look at a piece of code now. There we go. JavaScript, mostly Mitchell Whitelaw's, of course, with possibly some changes made by myself. There's only one word that I'd really like you to notice, and that's that word random, more or less in the middle of the screen there, math.random. So Mitchell's, the way the code was actually working was with this constrained randomization, and the little piece of code that we can see there is actually deciding on how the next image might be overlain or cropped or replicated, tiled across the existing image, across the artwork that's being essentially built up. So randomization in the selection of which images make the artwork, and randomization in how the one artwork is transformed to go on to the other, and critically an operation called blending that happens in the browser that does the detail work of putting one image on, mixing two images to create a third. And this is that basic set of global composition operations that can be used to produce a third image out of two inputs. So somehow Mitchell was getting the images that he was making from the material from Newcastle, mixing and matching and combining them and blending them using these fundamental operations in the browser. So just moving on, we can now look at the entities that were actually the imagery that was the source for these random operations. What you're looking at here are what Digital New Zealand calls stories, sets, sort of self-curated little collections of imagery or text out of drawn from out of any or all of the repositories that Digital New Zealand partners with. So you can see my name pops up in a few of these little collections of images. There's one from MTG Hawke's Bay, and there's a new one there from someone called Mary Hay. I don't recall seeing that before, so the research on Colenso is ongoing, clearly. But I used the Digital New Zealand API to randomly select from out of these sets of images, and then to perform those random operations, much along the lines of Mitchell's code, to generate the images that you see. So there's a fairly immediate step in between this, the stories that have been assembled here and the use of the images in the application, and that's the question of whether we actually have permission to do that. So I'm going to just use one item, this one here, which is William Colenso's press proof of the treaty. Now, you probably didn't notice, but it was in one of the pictures that Sydney showed. The original was actually on the wall in the exhibition in the Turnbull Gallery. And the question is then, can we make use of this in the digital artwork that was also on the wall and the little iPad on the wall in the gallery room? So that's sorted out with this from Digital New Zealand, and it's saying that that Digital New Zealand is not aware of what the rights status is of the item that we just saw. Digital New Zealand doesn't know, and the reason for that, and we won't delve in behind it, the reason is that the Alexander Turnbull Library doesn't give us a rights status for this particular item. In terms of our application, that actually means that we could not use the image that you just saw, and that led actually to a really kind of odd thing, that although the exhibition, the gallery and the items on the wall were primarily from the Turnbull Library, the digital artwork, its kind of center of gravity is probably more Te Papa than anywhere else, with contributions scattered around the country, and only a very small amount of material from the Alexander Turnbull Library itself. So that's the rights management issue. The next kind of issue that rolled into the design and how the app actually worked was the question of what you can actually do with the Digital New Zealand API. Now, the Digital New Zealand API, the licensing for it, is a kind of a moving target, and I was quite surprised when we came to prepare slides for this talk at how far along that API has moved. It now has rather more in the way of constraints than it used to, and looking at the fine print here, it's clear to me that it's actually time that we re-engineered some aspects of the application, because we fall foul of some of the conditions of use in the revised Digital New Zealand API. On the positive side of the ledger, whoever has revised the API is now aware of a particular structuring that we chose to use for the API. And that structure was that we would use the API in the background. The API is used in a GitLab pipeline that does some processing of the metadata that's pulled down from those Colenso stories that you saw at the start. And of course, as I've just described, the very first operation is to check the rights for the images. There are quite a number of other quite a number of other processes that happen in the background to do with sorting out different types of images and seeing whether the URLs that Digital New Zealand supplied were to web apps themselves or to PDFs, or whether they were directly to images, whether there were security problems or any other sorts of problems. But the output from the GitLab pipeline is a configuration that is then rolls into the web application. So we've got a kind of a two-part structure. We have a back room, if you like, that knows the Digital New Zealand API key, mine to be precise, that its output is the whole of the web app, and the web app includes configuration that allows it to reach directly out to whichever repository is holding the image that is going to be used. So inside your browser, a random selection of 5 images will be made. Those images will be retrieved from the content partners, from Digital New Zealand's the appropriate content partner. There will then be this dice rolling and randomization in terms of cropping, tiling, placement of images, but also in terms of the blending, how the actual screen in the application is composed. Right, so there we are. We had our exhibition. So far so good. A little while down the track, we struck some problems, and I've dug out the email that followed on from a major problem which occurred wherever we were picking out imagery of newspapers. Now, that was all coming from papers past. And of course, the first point to make here is how absolutely valuable being able to actually reach out to someone while trying to sort out seemingly an issue with the API, with coding or whatever, being able to reach out to someone at National Library was to be able to move forward. So here's a little conversation with Emerson. He explains that the papers past had a bit of a re-architecture of their URLs, that Digital New Zealand hadn't caught up with that. There was a bit of a gap in what was going on at their end. So this is the bit that was the unwelcome bit, but the unexpected bit was to come back nearly a month later and have Sydney report that the workaround that I'd put in place, which was to drop all of the newspapers, made the compositions from the app much better. Now, Sydney and I ended up talking a lot about this, about random, but also about the fact that the putting the puzzle together in your head, which is what you do when you have one of these very strange blended images, that it's what's going on in your head that's really interesting, and that the processing that happens when you see type, when you see words, was somehow, it seemed, getting in the way of appreciating the otherwise sort of pastel or watercolor or translucent overlays that were happening with the non-type material. So here is a commentator that I found yesterday, maybe day before, talking about this sort of what's going on here, this sort of theorizing. But what I liked about this quote is that the commentator chooses to refer to Brian Eno, who's described himself as a non-musician among musicians. He didn't let the fact that he was not a music virtuoso stop him from being a very productive member of a rock band, and that he found that the nature of that involvement was this iteration of, in his case, music, of course. In my case, what I was doing was this completely weird process that Mitchell described. He said he'd spent 3 months picking and choosing data while writing code, picking and choosing images, writing code, and then seeing what it looked like in pursuit of an aesthetic. And that was quite a new thing for me, the whole idea that I might, actually my work might involve an aesthetic was exceedingly strange, shall we say. But I think on that note, just finishing up with that progress, if you like, from software engineer to creative coder, that transition is my reflection on, is thinking about that is really my counterpart to what I think the whole idea of the digital or generative artwork is, that it makes something go on in your head. But I'd like to hand back to Sydney now to carry the discussion on.
Okay, thanks, Rhys. I'm aware of time, and what I might do is just a bit of an overview of the what next on this project. It is a legacy project. If we had world enough time and funding, we'd continue to refine, to add to fix some of the quirks. But I guess what was really useful for us was to get some feedback from specific users. And one of them suggested that the layers and the masking effect generate curiosity, and the juxtapositions often lead to something akin to metaphorical astonishment, inviting me to not only understand the component pieces, to reverse engineer the ingredients, but to also pattern seek by imagining causal connections between them, to resolve these gestalt images into something connectively meaningful. Other users said to us that, you know, have you got an option to share the images that have been produced? Can we save and store the images? And most intriguingly, can we generate our own images by selecting which basic of 5 images that we want? So these all led us to start thinking about where to take the project. But in a broader sense, quite apart from migration of platforms and softwares and all that gory stuff that you have to deal with legacy projects, we started speculating as to whether the kind of future of AI as embedded in cultural heritage institutions, should it be embedded as business as usual, or is it just a nice to have, something that, you know, creative researchers do, people who want to interrogate historical processes? Is it the nice to have or business as usual? And is there a role there for cultural heritage institutions to champion what in effect is a digital lab, so that you can not only build projects like these, but more specifically build new kinds of technical frameworks for engagement with your publics? So I'll leave it at that, and we'll open the floor to questions.
Wow, thank you, Sydney and Rhys. That was really interesting. And I just, there are so many threads that I would be interested in picking up out of your, so many different angles from which we could explore this. I'd like to remind our audience that you feel free to ask a question or make a comment in the chat window. And Adam or I will share those things with Sydney. Ingrid and Mary will help us make sure we're on top of those. But perhaps I can start, and I'm wondering how to articulate this, and I hope it comes across correctly. But you said in the opening part, Sydney, you talked a lot about terms like storytelling and palimpsest, and the way we do history often depends upon material culture and archives and those sorts of things. And there's a necessary, and Colenso is a perfect example of this, there's a necessary, not necessary, an effect of that, which sometimes means that when we tell history, it's centered on a protagonist, to take the storytelling metaphor a little bit further, that is gendered in a certain way, that is culturally represented in a certain way. And I wonder whether your project is demonstrating a bit of the possibility of tech to sort of toss that balance up in the air a little bit more, and perhaps make the protagonist someone other than the person who wrote the archive, if that question makes sense.
It's a really good question, and thanks for it, because my most recent work is shifting the voice of the archive from those, you know, single embodied entities, as in people, to the objects, and getting the objects to tell their own stories. So what does an autobiography of a book look like? You know, the beautiful images on your wall, what are those birds talking about between each other? that sort of thing. So I think in my research journey, making connections between disparate objects enables you to tell one kind of narrative. I think the ways in which those objects interact and have different lives that aren't subsumed by that master narrative, that single male colonizing perspective, really liberates a historian to think in Hayden White's terms that all history is narrative, but who is telling the story? And who is telling the story and who owns the story is as much an indication of your positionality as it is an impoverishment potentially or a liberation of those objects in the archives, whether they exist or not.
It's an interesting comment there at the end. Adam, did you have a question?
Yeah, no, I'll just remind people to ask questions in the chat, and we'll be monitoring those. I guess just as working in an organisation that's spent, I don't know, the last decade digitizing collections, it is really amazing to see these kind of new ways of accessing them and sort of exploring the collections. And so I guess just my small pitch there is just, you know, working with Digital in New Zealand, working with those large aggregators is a fantastic way for museums, archives, libraries to get their content in front of researchers like yourselves, and something that we should continue to push. That's not a question, that was just a pitch for Digital New Zealand, to be honest, because I think they're amazing. My question is...
in associated, Rhys's point about making sure your rights are clear as well is a really important hand-in-hand part of that as well.
That's it. I say the rights teams, I'm sure in all organisations are well aware of the many challenges, but trying to standardise, and I know the Digital New Zealand has done some fantastic work to try and standardise that. I was really interested in that last point you made, Sydney, around how do we embed this? And I know we've had some conversations. Is this something that we need to be looking at, or you know, AI and sort of machine learning? Do we need to embed that into our organisations as core functions? In, you know, should it be in people's PDs, or is this a separate function that sits outside? And I just sort of wondered if you had any examples of places that are doing this really well, or examples we could maybe go and have a look at. And I can see there's benefits to both ways. And I do want to put that question back to you around, where do you see this sitting?
Well, I'll defer to Rhys here because he's got quite a strong position when it comes to thinking about digital labs and how those should be embedded in institutions. But I won't take his fire. Go ahead, Rhys.
Go for it.
I suppose I should start out by saying that my work for the last 5 years probably has come to revolve very much around Git, around a code repository, and I think there's that managed repositories of code are actually becoming as that can be the locus for software in general and AI and in particular, and that the sophistication that we're now seeing in software development, whether it's proprietary or the mixed models between collaborative and proprietary, and the in streams and the downstreams and the upstreams, that there's room in there for creating online digital labs. And I would say now the very definition of an online digital lab is GitLab or GitHub with pipelines built out from it, hosting a variety of web apps, providing for issues, providing gateways for support, providing wikis and blogs and all the rest of it, and that infrastructure that's kind of partly inside but largely outside an institution, is there to be used by organizations that can build their capability and their capability alongside their community.
I think, you know, thinking back to the talk we had last time with Thomas, where we talked about actually that we also need to upskill staff and think about some training, because I know some of this is going to seem quite impenetrable to some members of our teams, and I agree that we need to be looking at how do we involve a wider community and using sites like GitHub. But we're going to require this kind of to generally upskill and just break down some of those barriers. It doesn't have to be really scary. And actually there's this fantastic community out there who's willing to help. And we just need to, think of strategies to enable that. And I think that's in the paper Thomas presented last time, there was some really nice methods and ideas around that. And I'm just seeing in the comments there that yes, there's more collabs, something that we should be doing, and that institutions across the board should be more lab-like to enable this. Awesome.
I guess if I could interject too here, you know, having created a number of projects which for various reasons, generally funding and timeframes, have a life and then have a pause, and sometimes die, sometimes go into dark archive, deep preservation, if we want to call it that. And what that means is that you get opportunities that are in effect lost because someone else comes forward and does virtually the same thing a few years later. So the sustainability of these kinds of initiatives has to be bedded into an institutional framework and a kind of cooperative model whereby as all parties are being upskilled in developing these kinds of spaces, it's also a space of enabling the future of these kinds of projects and more. So often, you know, projects like this sit as isolated instances around the world, and there's never anything to move them forward. And I think, you know, that idea of business as usual or technical frameworks for engagement starts shifting the rhetoric so it becomes more institutionally focused, where the people within the institution are as much the makers and the creative reusers of the objects that they create as those people who are doing the research. So as you know, if we can break those barriers down, then I think we'll be in a far better position to be able to create sustainable monuments to the institutions that we're reliant upon.
Awesome.
Yeah,
so you got my vote.
Yeah, that sounded amazing. You did talk about the institutions, and you've provided some feedback from users and visitors who about their perceptions of the project. How did you find the feedback from the institutions or the curators or collection managers who were involved or whose collections were used in this project?
Because we had done both the exhibition and the artwork, the digital artwork, it meant we had to get up close and personal with institutions and their curators. We had a great day in Te Papa looking at their taxidermy collections, for example, to select items to put in the cases. So there were really great, you know, person-to-person opportunities. But moving it into the digital space was interesting because licensing, rights management, the sense that these digital objects stand apart from the institution's physical collections was for me a bit of a surprise. I don't see the digital object as a surrogate. I see it as another kind of object. But the fact that they sort of live out there, they're the product of digitization, and then anybody else can go away and play with them suggests there's a kind of disconnect that was really bizarre. And so while they really loved the idea of what we were doing in creating this amazing artwork, it was sort of quizzical. Some of the feedback in the visitors' books, for example, in the exhibition was saying, I don't know why those iPads are there. You know, it seems a bit of a temporal disjunction, and, you know, we wanted people to be surprised and engaged. Rhys won't bore you with all the horrors of trying to get the iPads to work in the spaces, but because it hadn't been done before, you know, there were these challenges that had to be surmounted rather than, okay, we've got the tech there, let's see what we can do with it. But, you know, institutions enjoyed it. It got good PR, good press, but, you know, like many things, it was a bit of a flash in the pan, because what we tried to do was to, in both the exhibition and the artwork, shift the institutional thinking about what an exhibition could be and how it could be mounted. And that was pretty controversial for a start. And I'll just leave it at that.
Well, perhaps picking up on that thread slightly, we did have a question here in the chat from, Nicola Friend, asking about, talking about the fact that their team spends a lot of time and energy added in description and context to digitised content from unpublished collections, including some that were used in unexpected connections. And some of this is around things like rights, but some is around complex provenance and purpose and relationships between items. She's asked about how this sort of metadata could be managed in a way that it might always travel with the digital surrogates that you used, and how people see that carrying through in future interfaces.
Well, certainly the way that Mitchell and then we adopted his method of display was that you have the palimpsest, but then you also have every single item that composes the palimpsest below, and a link to that institution, that object, and of course the metadata with it. So you can drill down to get that metadata. So it does carry it across with the object, if it's been linked initially anyway. Have I got that right, Rhys?
Yeah, that's...
I mean, part of it's what Digital New Zealand does with the metadata in between, does it?
Digital New Zealand is really trying to make it easy and compress a really quite complex rights landscape down into a few very straightforward handles. We were just looking for the magical reuse tag. But Nicola's certainly right in as far as there's a complex set of relationships behind rights, and they're not, of course, not all summed up in copyrights either. There are the sort of less legalistic rights of traditional rights, I suppose you'd say, in and around some of the imagery.
I put in that link to knowledge graphs, because I think that exemplifies at least what ontotext can do in terms of turning your collections into a set of relational collections with RDF triples. And I think that way at least gives you the possibility of grabbing the more comprehensive metadata and having it travel not only with a single object, but to see those kinds of more invisible relationships being surfaced according to, you know, your particular interest, if it's a donor or some sort of provenance history. I think, you know, that idea is something that I'd love to explore further with these kinds of objects.
Awesome. Well, I am just going to, I notice we now have just 3 minutes left on the clock. So I just wondered if there were any final points from Sydney, Rhys or Alexis. All good. Well, I do just want to say thank you very much for your time today. It was a really fascinating insight into the project that you've worked on. And I know you've got other projects that will sort of hopefully pencil you in to come back and talk to the group. So thank you very much for your time today. I do, in the chat there, Ingrid has been working with Mary to, hello Ingrid, to put out as many of the links that we've been talking about today. And after today, we'll be sending out the video and those links again. So yeah, thank you to Mary and Ingrid for keeping that under control and keeping us all informed, busy behind the scenes.
Well, I was going to say, Adam, I think we've had a very quiet audience today, and I'm really intrigued to know why they're so quiet. So while we're wrapping up, I'm just wondering if they've got any takeaway thoughts.
I'll give people time as they're busy typing.
They can always feel free to take up this conversation in the Slack channel as well, which Sydney and Rhys and all of us are part of as well. So that could be another avenue if people have thoughts after the event. We have also, where we share the video after the event, we'll also share those links as well. So if people want to pursue those things at their leisure.
That's it. Let's say so. If you are interested, make sure you check out or join the Slack channel. There's a really active conversation happening there, both within the New Zealand Australia group, but also the wider group. And I think it's whenever I jump in there, I realise that there's so a range of projects happening, and it always makes me feel like I have no idea what's going on, but that's fantastic because I read something and learn something new. So really encourage people to join in there and join us for next time as we continue to look for speakers and projects that we can share with the community. So that was it from me. Just thank you to all the participants, to Rhys and Sydney, to Alexis, Ingrid and Mary, and to all the people listening in the background. Thank you for spending some time with us today. Kia ora.
Kia ora.
Yeah.
Bye.
Thank you.
That was awesome. I took notes. That's the right way. I love your transformation, software engineer to creative coder. That is just so awesome. I just have and see all these software engineers
I feel a t-shirt coming on.
I'd buy it.
Yeah, no, it was actually a bit scary. It was like, where's my spec?
Oh, that whole
What do you-
unboundedness.
Yeah, what do you mean you just pick and choose out of the data?
That's really lovely. Wow. We've got someone telling us we're still live. Oh,
Yeah, we are. Hi, it's Jason.
Yeah, it's
Hi,
amazing.
Jason.
Yeah, how you doing?
Good, thanks. Thanks for tuning in.
That was great. Very good.
So we'll put the challenge out.